Have you ever noticed how the same generation that was once told, "Don't come back inside until dinner," is now being criticized for being too involved in their kids' lives? It sounds almost ironic. The kids who practically raised themselves are now accused of hovering. The teenagers who figured things out alone are now the parents showing up to every meeting, every game, every crisis. If you grew up in the late 60s, 70s, or early 80s, you probably remember the sound of your own key turning in the front door. No one home, the house quiet, maybe a note on the counter, maybe not. You made your own snack, you did your homework, or didn't, and life just moved. It wasn't dramatic, it was normal. By the 1970s and 80s, dual-income households had become increasingly common in the United States. According to data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the percentage of mothers with young children in the workforce rose sharply during that period. At scale, something shifted. For the first time in modern American history, a huge wave of kids were regularly coming home to empty houses. They were later called latchkey kids. And here's the thing about being a latchkey kid. You don't necessarily experience it as trauma. You experience it as Tuesday. You learn how to microwave things. You learn how to solve your own problems. You learn that if you forgot your homework, that's on you. If you got into a fight with a friend, no adult was swooping in to negotiate a peace treaty. You handled it, or you didn't. Independence wasn't a philosophy. It was survival through routine. But independence has layers. On the outside, it looks like competence. On the inside, it can quietly become emotional self-containment. You stop expecting someone to check in. You stop assuming someone is tracking your feelings. You become self-reliant. And self-reliance feels strong until you realize it sometimes came with loneliness. Fast forward a few decades. Now you're the parent, and suddenly, when your child walks through the door after school, you remember what it felt like to walk into silence. When they tell you about something that went wrong, you remember what it felt like not to tell anyone. Something subtle happens in that moment. You don't consciously say, "I'm going to parent the opposite way," but your nervous system remembers. Many Gen X parents will tell you they never planned to be over-involved. They valued the freedom they had growing up. They don't want to micromanage. They don't want to hover. But when it actually matters, when there's bullying or unfair treatment or a serious issue, they don't hesitate. Some people jokingly call them stealth fighter parents. They're not circling overhead all day, but if something crosses a line, they appear fast, focused, and intense. From the outside, that can look contradictory. Weren't you the figure-it-out-yourself generation? Yes, exactly, and that's why. There's a well-known framework in developmental psychology developed by Diana Baumrind that categorizes parenting styles based on two dimensions: responsiveness and demandingness. In simple terms, how emotionally available you are and how clearly you enforce boundaries. Authoritative parenting, high warmth, high expectations, consistently shows the strongest outcomes in long-term research. Children raised in that style tend to have higher self-esteem, better emotional regulation, and stronger problem-solving skills across decades of studies. What's interesting is that while there's no massive data set proving Gen X universally adopted this style, the way many of them describe their parenting sounds strikingly similar. "I'm here for you, but you're still responsible." That sentence captures an entire philosophy. They don't want their kids to feel abandoned, but they also don't want them to feel fragile, because Gen X knows what instability looks like. They entered adulthood in recessions. They watched corporate loyalty fade. They saw pensions disappear. They learned early that systems don't always protect you. So when they raise kids, there's this quiet undercurrent. I can't promise you the world will be stable, but I can help you become strong enough to navigate it. And they're doing this in a completely different cultural environment than the one they grew up in. They had childhoods where embarrassing moments disappeared by Monday. Today, a single mistake can live online indefinitely. They remember boredom, real boredom, where you had to invent your own fun because the internet didn't exist yet. So when they set limits on screens, it's not just fear. It's lived contrast. They know what presence felt like before constant connectivity. At the same time, they're not technophobes. They adapted to the digital revolution in adulthood. They use the tools, but they also question the cost. It's a complicated balancing act. And while they're trying to raise emotionally secure kids, they're often simultaneously caring for aging parents, managing mid-career plateaus, navigating financial pressures. They're frequently described as the sandwich generation, squeezed between responsibilities on both sides. Boomer parents sometimes look at them and say, "You're too soft." Gen Z kids sometimes look at them and say, "You're too strict." They're translating between two cultural languages that don't share a dictionary. But here's something that stands out about Gen X. They don't obsess over external validation the way some other generations might. Maybe that comes from growing up without constant oversight. You learned early that approval wasn't guaranteed, so you developed an internal compass. And that internal compass now guides their parenting. They'll let their teenager fail a test and feel the consequences. They won't call the teacher immediately, but if something truly unjust happens, they'll be the first one in the building. They remember what it felt like to have no one to call at 2 a.m., so now they make sure their child can. There's something quietly radical about that. It's not about being perfect. It's about being present in ways they didn't experience consistently themselves. And presence, for a generation raised on self-sufficiency, is a deliberate choice. It would have been easier to default to distance, to say, "You'll figure it out like I did." Instead, many chose to add something new: emotional availability. Not smothering, not constant surveillance, but awareness. They're trying to keep the best parts of their upbringing, resilience, independence, adaptability, while softening the edges that once felt sharp. That's not a clean formula. It doesn't fit neatly into parenting trend cycles. It doesn't always align with what social media says is right, but it's deeply intentional. And maybe that's why Gen X parenting often feels understated. They're not broadcasting every milestone. They're not necessarily chasing online applause for how they raise their kids. They're operating from the memory of unlocking a door to an empty house, from the memory of solving problems alone, from the memory of wishing, quietly, that someone had noticed a little more. So when they sit in the bleachers at a school event, maybe looking slightly uncomfortable in a sea of hyper-involved parents, they're still there, fully there. Not because they were taught to be, but because they decided to be. And maybe that's the real story. A generation once labeled as detached, cynical, or underparented is now consciously trying to create a blend of strength and support. Not perfect, not always consistent, but intentional. If you're a Gen X parent watching this, maybe you see yourself in that tension between independence and involvement, between toughness and tenderness. And if you're the child of one, maybe this helps explain why they seem relaxed about some things and fiercely protective about others. It's not random. It's memory, reshaped into intention. And that might be one of the most powerful forms of growth there is. If this perspective resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience. Did you grow up with that key around your neck, or are you raising kids while still unpacking your own childhood? Drop your thoughts below. And if you enjoy these deep psychological dives into generational patterns, make sure you subscribe, because there's a lot more beneath the surface than we usually talk about.